Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Novel Voices event. My name is John McAuliffe, and I am Professor of Poetry and Director of the Centre for New Writing here at the University of Manchester. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to what is the fourth in our online series, Novel Voices, with Cherie Jones and Nekesa Afia. We run these events with our partners at the university's Creative Manchester initiative and with our bookshop partners, Blackwell's. Our host and this series curator is Ellah Wakatama. And I'm going to briefly introduce Ellah now before telling you about how the event is going to be structured tonight. Ellah, as many of you know, is Senior Research Fellow here at the university, as well as being Editor-at-Large at Canongate Books, and has actually also been teaching seminars on contemporary fiction all day today. So she is certainly very busy at the moment, as ever. In 2011, Ellah was awarded an OBE for services to the publishing industry, and she has since then, among many other things, served on the judging panel of the 2017 Dublin International Literary Award and the 2015 Man Booker Prize, as well as inspirationally continuing to develop the Kane Prize and starting and advancing so many of the conversations which are current now about publishing and culture in the UK. Her plan for Novel Voices this semester is to introduce you to some of the best new fiction being published by first-time authors, voices you will be hearing for the first time, who we hope you will be hearing from for many years to come. A couple of other things before I hand over to Ellah. Please do use the Q&A button at the foot of your screen to post questions to our guests. So that's the little button that's across the way at the bottom, and pop your questions for Cherie and Nekesa there. And also, if you could just tell us in the chat where it is you're watching this event from tonight. As many of you who are attending these events for the third or fourth time will know, it's really enjoyable to get a sense of who exactly gets gathered in these virtual spaces that we have learned so much about over the last year. And finally, a reminder that you can get discounted books from tonight's authors via Blackwell's, our bookshop partners for this event. So I'm going to hand over to Ellah, who is going to take us on from here.
John, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you to all my colleagues at Creative Manchester and also at the university. It is such a joy to be here with you. As John said, this is the fourth in our Novel Voices series, the penultimate one, and I'm finding myself rather sad that it's about to come to an end, because I've had such a wonderful time being introduced to new writers, not least the two who we'll be speaking with today. These are two writers whose debut novels take us to Harlem during the Prohibition era and to Barbados, behind the scenes of pristine beaches and holidaying tourists. In each case, we're introduced to two formidably imagined protagonists whose stories explore two realities that are very different, but that each shine a light on the struggles of women of color over time to claim their own lives, their own identities, and their own destinies. So let me introduce you to our guests. Nekesa Afia is the author of Dead, Dead Girls, and it's published by Berkeley, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. The book is the first in the Harlem's Hero series of mysteries, featuring a young queer Black woman named Louise, and it's set in Harlem, as I said, during the Prohibition era. It's a refreshingly original contribution to the ever-popular crime mystery genre, and features a heroine whose complicated personality and her interactions with the close-knit neighborhood she lives in promise a gripping and memorable series. I'm personally looking forward to I think it's an HBO TV series rather than a film, Nekesa, just saying. I can't wait for that. Nekesa is Canadian and a recent graduate with a degree in journalism from Sentinel College in Toronto, and she also has a publishing certificate. Nekesa, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and good afternoon from Toronto, Ontario.
Cherie Jones' debut, published by Tinder Press, HarperCollins, is titled How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House. The novel is long listed for the 2021 Women's Prize for Fiction. It's so well deserved. And it's an astonishingly accomplished debut set in Barbados, which tells the story of Lala, and through her, the stories of her mother and her grandmother, women who are as resilient as they are vulnerable. Cherie was born in Barbados, where she was admitted to the bar in 1997. And as well as this legal career, she's a graduate of the MA program at Sheffield Hallam University. Prior to publishing her first full-length work of fiction, Cherie published The Burning Bushwoman and Other Stories with People to Press in 2004. And her story Bride was the winner of the 1999 Commonwealth Short Story Prize. Cherie, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So I want to launch right in, and audience, we will have time at the end to open up for you to ask questions. My colleagues will tell you that I sometimes have trouble letting go of the writers, but I've promised to do better and to leave more time for the audience. So let's get going. There's so much for us to talk about. Nekesa, I wanted to start with you. From the very beginning, I was struck by the introduction you give us to Louise as a teenager. She has a sense of power. She takes control of situations, even when one would think that as a Black woman in that time, in those circumstances, that she would be helpless, but she's not. So I want to see if you could, to ask you to tell us about her, where she comes from, and also where that sense of agency and self comes from for that character.
Okay, I'd love to, because I love Lou. I love Louise so much, and it's been just a joy to like write her and like make her up. So I do think that she is a direct descendant of slavery, just from her grandparents and great grandparents, and her parents were also more than likely born into slavery. And because of that, she has had a very strict growing up, a very strict bringing up. She was raised in a religious household, supposed to do everything that she wanted. She was like supposed to do, but she kind of rebelled against that because she just didn't vibe with it, I guess. And she's just, I always say that she's like really scrappy, but like she goes to bat for people who she loves, and she loves her girlfriend and her girlfriend's brother and her sisters, and that's it. So she'll go to bat for those like 5 people, but like if you like hurt them or insult them in any way, she'll be at your throat. Like she, I think, she just shows so much like personality and so much strength, like especially like she's a Black lesbian in 1926. That is the last person you think to have any strength, but she knows like what the world she lives in, and she wants the world she lives in to be better. So that's kind of like where I was coming from with her.
I especially loved her because, you know, you do put her in a difficult time, but then if you're a queer Black woman, any time is going to be a difficult time. And, you know, I found that your depiction of her from the very beginning as a teenager, and then we meet her sort of as an adult, I think she's maybe 27, 28, that's only grown. As a reader, I found myself more than a little bit in love with her, and also pretty scared. So I wasn't quite sure where that would go. And so it's great that we have, that it's a series, we have more time to develop with her. Cherie, it's a very different situation for Wilma and her granddaughter Lala and her daughter Lala's mother. Given what happens to each of these women in your book, it's hard to imagine that one would necessarily point them as examples of powerful women, but I did find power in each of those characters, if only in the fact of survival. Is that how you see it?
That's definitely how I see it. For me, the triumph for these women, all 3 women, but Lala especially, is just being able to survive and overcome the circumstances in which she finds herself. So I think, yes, when we meet them in the novel, they are quite disempowered. There's a lack of agency, certainly on Lala's part. But I certainly do think that by the end of the novel, there's been some progression. And what I hope that the novel does is to question notions of power and the parameters within which we expect women to function and thrive in local and regional society. So yes.
I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about with both books, and it's a question for both of you, Cherie and Nekesa, is that, I don't know if you remember that poem about I think it's called This Bridge Called My Back, and it's discussing this idea of strong Black women and how sometimes that pronouncement of us as strong or powerful is an excuse to walk on our backs with feet. And I just wondered how you navigate that tension where you want to explore those parameters of power, as it were, but you also want to remain truthful, because there's a certain permission I think we sometimes need to give ourselves to be vulnerable in that way. And Nekesa, I think perhaps I'm going to ask you first, because I think Louise is more sort of, forthrightly a woman in control as much as she can be. But I wondered how you navigated that tension.
That's a great question. I think definitely giving her like an established like love interest and like families and like her like sisters, they do bring out like the vulnerability in her, and they do like allow her to like show her like softer side. I also made sure to like put points in where like Lou could be like angry or sad or like where she can like show her emotions and not just be like the strong Black woman, no crying, just let's go and do our stuff. So I thought it was like important that she like show like a range of emotions, and like that's what like really makes her human. And I think that's like what will endear readers to her.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad it's something that you had so obviously thought about, because I felt in reading both of your books that you were quite purposeful in how you navigated that. Cherie, can you tell us a little bit about how you navigated that tension?
Well, yes, that definitely was an issue for me. I remember thinking, I have this idea of literature altogether, and Caribbean novels in particular, as having a bit of a responsibility and a transformative objective. Let me put it that way. But in a lot of cases, the reality is that we're not there yet. And as it relates to women in circumstances like Lala, we really aren't there. So the tension for me, the challenge was being able to be true to Lala's circumstances and the reality of many women in the Caribbean, certainly, at the time of the novel and even up to today, while also kind of signposting a possible alternative future. And that actually was really, really difficult for me to do. When I looked at the novel in that regard, I had to kind of review my own notions of what strength means for those women in the novel. What does strength mean for Wilma? Isn't she strong? By virtue of the fact that, she finds ways to cope with Carson and who he is and how he damages her and her children. They may not be the right ways, quote unquote, right ways or what's advisable, but there is a certain strength in the fact that she chooses to deal with it in a particular manner. I think by the end, Lala's future is left, I think, to the imagination, but I think the reader gets enough information to demonstrate the way in which she has changed by the end of the novel, and the fact that she is more able and at the point now where she can fully step into her power as a woman.
I really loved the way that you're talking about that survival, and thinking, Nekesa, about what you said, referring to ancestry. So the reality for, a writer who's writing Black women in the diaspora, unless they're sort of, African migrants like myself, but if they're people of color who are born in those Western countries, and there is that reality of this is where we've come from. We have come as descendants of kidnapped, enslaved Africans. And there's a weight to that. And what I really appreciated with both of you was that history is still there. So it's like a memory behind us in behaviors, in family dynamics, but you don't allow it to be heavy on us. It's a reality in the way that, people carry it as a reality. Is that something that you were also conscious of in the same way as that tension with sort of power and vulnerability, that how do you communicate that this is the result of the people having this difficult inheritance? I'm Cherie, I'd like to start with you on that.
So yes, the difficult inheritance does definitely contribute to, you know, the fact that the characters in the novel have some of the difficulties that they do have. They're not, you know, it's not many generations removed from, you know, a past that includes slavery, includes a legacy of violence. And those are things that transcend, you know, passed down through generations. So I think that's definitely a challenge. In terms of not making it weighty, I think that while I don't go into it in a lot of detail, I think it's very much present, and necessarily so, because I don't think we have yet traveled as far in time. I don't know if we ever will. That legacy will not have a very heavy impact on how we live, even now. So I think it definitely was a very present, very real consideration for the characters, even though I don't go into it in that much detail.
It's like they're carrying those memories in their bones as well. I think that was something that was very skillfully done. And Nekesa, you're writing in a period of sort of the Harlem Renaissance, where we think of, you know, all of this outpouring of African-American talent and everything else. But as you say, that burden is still there. How did you find that balance in the same way that I asked Cherie?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about it a lot lately, actually, because there's been a lot of discussions about Black trauma on social media and stuff, and like, where's the line, and like, what do we do? And of course, this book is filled to the brim with Black trauma, and I apologize for that, but this was the story I wanted to tell. So I think offsetting like the heaviness with like moments of joy, like Louise goes dancing a lot, and like I used to go dancing a lot before there was a pandemic, and I miss it and I love it. So like just little things like where she can be totally herself, be totally happy, and like the reader can be there with her. I think that sort of does offset the trauma and like the heaviness of like her upbringing and like her past and like her history.
I don't think that you should apologize, because I think it's something, you know, there's that, Cherie spoke about that transformative objective, which I thought was like magical phrasing, because I think by acknowledging that heaviness, but then giving us a way to cope and to survive it through your characters was incredibly powerful to me. It's something you do incredibly well. You've each chosen a very specific era for setting your story. So Cherie, I'd like to start with you. We are for most of the book, I think, in the mid-1980s. Can you speak to us a little bit about what it is about that particular time in terms of Barbadian society and culture? And also, I think the experience of foreign tourists and those owners of holiday homes that made you feel that this was the time in which the story would work best.
So the first thing I would say about that is it you know, the era that I chose, the time period, had a lot to do with the character that came to me. For most of my stories, I actually feel as if I received the story. I know that might sound a little strange, but essentially I will have a character speak to me in my head, or I'll see a scene and, you know, just want to find out more about it and so on. So it's that type of a process for me. I actually feel as if I receive a story from somewhere else. And when I first heard from Lala, you know, it became clear to me because of what she was saying to me that she braided hair on the beach. Now that was very much a feature of my childhood. I'm not going to age myself too much, but mid-1980s, let's just say I was, you know, sort of going into adolescence and and coming into, you know, who I am as a person. I think that was a period for me when I kind of started to break away from, you know, everything my parents and other adults and elders would be saying to me. And it was more about coming into myself as a person. So finding out that Lala was a hair braider kind of narrowed down the time frame for me, because that's something that was very much on the beaches in Barbados. Quite apart from that, I loved the 80s. So I was so happy you know, when I understood that that was the time period I was going to be talking about, because the 80s, like I said, that's when I came into my own as a person. I was a teenager in the 80s, so there were lots of features and details about that time that were very sharp in my mind, and that I thought represented a little bit of our forgotten history. There's some things from that era. The hair braiders on the beach is one. String bags is another one. Things that would have been all around at that time and weren't anymore. So it was an opportunity for me to go back into that time frame. Quite apart from that, 1984-85 represented less than 20 years from independence for Barbados. And I think that's when tourism is the main pillar of our economy. And that's when tourism was really on the up for us. And when we were really getting very sensitive to the economic potential, I think, for tourism, and how we as individuals fell into that, how we fit into that whole notion of, you know, being the island paradise. And there were some important things that happened in the mid 1980s. I remember there was a case where a woman was fired from a local hotel, a Black woman, for going to work with her hair braided. So there were a number of things happening in the 80s that were relevant to this story, and that I felt could be explored because of that being the time period for the majority of the action in the novel. So don't get me started on the 80s, but yes.
Oh no, I'm totally with you. I won't age myself either, but I do know what you're talking about.
You understand what I'm talking about? Okay, yeah. I'm not alone then.
No, you're not alone. Thank you for that. That makes complete sense to me, because I think that interaction between those with holiday homes, those who are just there as tourists, and those who live there, is for me at the very heart of the book, those social dynamics. And I want to talk about that a little bit later. Nekesa, your book is set even further in the past. And I wondered, because I was just so intrigued by the level of detail, and it made me so happy. I wondered, what were the most difficult aspects of researching this period? Did you find the sources that you particularly needed easily, or were there some challenges along the way?
Yeah, so I always say that getting the vibes, it's exactly right, like just the vibes of the era, and like just getting those exactly right was really an interesting challenge, because I'm getting myself into the head of a woman who lived 100 years ago and has lived a completely different life than I could ever think to live. But yeah, so there's things like, oh, I started making clothes from 1920s patterns. I started doing swing dancing, and I learned how to do like the Charleston and the Lindy Hop and dances that they'd be doing in the clubs. And yeah, so other than like the book research and like the library research and the internet research, I found that like trying to like really get myself into Lou's shoes really helped me like get to know her.
I love it. I don't think I've ever heard this kind of method writing before. It's like method acting, where you not only have sort of the stuff intellectually, but you put it into your body as well.
Yeah, well, I always like want to know. And that's like a big thing. If I can't relate to the character, I can't expect the reader to relate to the character.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I always just want to know. So yeah, and it's good, it's fun.
I think that for me as a reader, it was so worth whatever work you put into it, because, you know, we were discussing earlier the cocktails and how you'd research the cocktails, but also things like, you know, when you describe a perfume or a hair pomade, I smelt them as I went along, and that totally immersed and just was something I really enjoyed about the book. Because sometimes I think with, I guess it's historical fiction as well as being sort of crime and mysteries, that you can feel a little bit disconnected from the physicality of it all, and that was done beautifully. The period that you're writing, Nekesa, is most popularly captured in literature by Scott Fitzgerald, but the world that Louise inhabits is very different from that of Gatsby and his ilk, and it's not because, not least because we're following a Black queer woman in this period, and she's not someone who comes from wealth at all. And so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about that, just in terms of research, because for me as a reader, that Gatsby thing is the first thing that comes to mind, even though, I can then go on to think about the Harlem Renaissance and everyone else. And so I just wondered how you felt about that being the point of connection for so many writers, and you're giving us a completely different point of view.
It makes sense. Like, The Great Gatsby was also like my first major introduction into the 1920s, and like I love that book. I love Scott Fitzgerald. I prefer Zelda. If Scott Fitzgerald is a thief who stole from Zelda, but I will not get into that right now. So I just think that with my book specifically, you'll just get like a totally different view. And I do think that to a level, like Fitzgerald was like putting some rose-colored glasses on it. He's like, this was the best time ever. We were all rich, we were all constantly drunk, we were all just doing absolutely whatever. But that's not true for the majority of people. The KKK was back and more racist than ever. Just systemic racism absolutely everywhere. And it was a tough time to be Black, let alone a Black woman, let alone a Black lesbian. So I just wanted to like give a different viewpoint and a different like point of reference for readers.
At the same time as you're doing that, where there's a different point of reference, one of the things that I really admired is the fact that you do give us some of the tropes that one needs as a writer of mysteries, because you need, with genre fiction, I know that when I'm reading genre fiction, you kind of know how the story is going to go. You don't know the specifics, but you know what the rules are. And you give us that. I mean, you give us a wonderful origin story for this sleuth who we're going to be following. You give us her sidekicks, you give us her love interest, and her nemesis. All of those things are just so elegantly done. And yet I read an interview in which you said, you were talking about reading crime and mystery, and you said that you weren't really a fan of Agatha Christie. I don't know if I'm outing you in this now. So, Agatha Christie for me is maybe like, that's the golden age of kind of, mystery writing, and again, another reference point. And so I wondered about that tension in yourself as a reader and as a fan now writing in that very genre.
Thanks for calling me out like that. Yeah, it's true. So the thing is that most of Agatha Christie's novels are just people sitting around and like talking. And I've always discovered that like in anything, mostly mysteries, yes, but in anything, I need clear stakes, I need high stakes. And if that's not happening, if people are just talking and sitting around a dinner table, conversing about land and taxes, and also, I haven't read any other Agatha Christie novels, I'm sorry. But if they're just talking, if they're just sitting around and talking, then it's just boring and I'm not like into it. Like something has to grip me. So that's like what I wanted to do with this one. I wanted to write like a novel I wanted to see in a time period I wanted to write in with a heroine I could relate to, and like that was really important to me. So like getting her like, whole origin story, which might be frankly a little unbelievable, but it happened anyway. Like right into the way she like gets into like solving this case, to like how she does it is all like what I wanted to see and like how I figured it would work. So
we won't spoil it for people who have yet to have the joy of reading the book, but that origin story made perfect sense to me. It both explained the woman she would become, but it made sense because of the girl that she had to have been given her upbringing. I find it totally inspiring. I wondered, Nekesa, how does it change the story of that era when the reader's experiencing it through Louise and her world at the center?
I think it's always great for readers to get like a different viewpoint. So if they're just reading F. Scott Fitzgerald or Hemingway or anyone else who was just big into like the 20s and like publishing fiction like as they were happening, they're gonna get just a completely different like look. And of course, all of like Fitzgerald's people were just like white, like rich people like making movies and partying all the time. So I just think that like if they pick my book up, or when you pick my book up, you'll get a different sense of the 1920s, a different origin of the 1920s, a different vibe of the 1920s, different everything. And it was really, really fun to try to explore.
That's wonderful. I think it's a really good time for me to invite you to read a little bit for us, Nekesa. And if you could just set it up a tiny bit with no spoilers and tell us where we are. And then I'd love for you to read some of the book to us.
Of course, sorry, let me just move my little cup here. Of course, so I am reading from chapter 2. I'm going to read the first scene of chapter 2, and it is the day after Louise just went partying, and now she is hungover and trying to get to work. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. Chapter 2. The day that changed everything started routinely enough. Louise was wearing a black dress with low heels, ready for her long shift at Maggie's Cafe. The cafe was at the epicenter of Harlem, and Louise regarded the eponymous Maggie as her second mother. Truthfully, she loved working at the cafe. She was able to have a life, and the money she earned gave her freedom. And since it was Friday, she was counting down the hours until she could return to the Zodiac. She and Rosa Maria walked together arm in arm. Rosa Maria was wearing a light blue dress, a sparkly clip in her hair. "I want to go home," she said, her voice a low, growling whisper. Louise shook her head. "I don't." It was about to rain, and rainy days were good for the cafe. More people wanted to stay and watch the rain fall from the window. The cafe was the perfect place to wrap up with a cup of coffee and do nothing. And do nothing meant more small talk, which meant more extra tips. The girls walked slowly. Louise's body howled from dancing the night before. She was still trying to be the first person at the cafe, as she usually was. With every step she took, her cheap shoes clacked against the pavement cement, her sea of a stomach shifting. "Raphael shouldn't have let us drink like that," Rosa Maria said with a moan. She was always cranky when she was hungover, and she liked to blame things on her brother. "I didn't think you drank that much," Louise said, but they'd matched each other drink for drink. Louise had to stop every few steps to hold a hand over her mouth and pray she wouldn't vomit over her shoes on the sidewalk. She exhaled, straightened her spine, and pulled herself to her full 5'2". She was Louise Lloyd. Louise Lloyd didn't vomit in public or otherwise. It felt as if the other girls they lived with had been particularly loud this morning. It was hard to compete with the girls on a full night's sleep. She had to fight for space with her housemates, doing their makeup, getting dressed, swapping clothes for the day. The house was a 15-minute walk from Maggie's Cafe. Louise was lucky. She lived in the same 30-block radius for her entire life. It was convenient, but she couldn't help but wonder what the rest of the world was like. She stopped, pulling Rosa Maria to a halt as well. There was someone lying in front of the door of the cafe. "Is she okay?" Rosa Maria asked. Louise stepped closer, her heart skittering in her chest. The girl was younger than Louise. She wore a black dress with intricate white beading. A string of pearls dangled around her neck. Her arms were spread wide, and her right hand held a little rectangular card with the Virgin Mary on it. The girl's eyes stared blankly at the sky. Her black skin was colorless. She was dead.
Wonderful. That little smile at the end of it. Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful passage to give us the sense of the tension which runs throughout the book because of these murdered girls who keep turning up, and the fact that they're all connected some way to Louise. I was reading on your website, and you have like a list of facts about yourself. The one that struck me the most, Nekesa, was you were referencing Josephine Baker and Ella Fitzgerald in that. And along with Zora Neale Hurston, I think those were the faces that I was picturing as I read the book before I looked at the website. So I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about women like Baker and Fitzgerald and Zora Neale Hurston and what they mean to you and how they maybe influenced the creation of Louise.
Yeah, so I think that especially Ella Fitzgerald. So I love Ella Fitzgerald. I love her so much. Like I would absolutely die for her in a moment. And whenever I go swing dancing, I'd ask whoever was DJing to like play me a song by Ella Fitzgerald. And I'm the most annoying person my friends know, and I'm totally okay with that. I love Ella Fitzgerald. And I think just like her determination and her skill and like her like not giving upness. Same with Josephine Baker, who she found that she wasn't accepted in New York, so whatever, she just went to Paris and then she adopted all these kids. I think she had a pet tiger. and she just lived life on her own terms. Like she worked in World War II, and I think she was the first woman to get a 21-gun salute when she died in France, because she worked in intelligence. And like, I think all of these women were so dynamic and so complex. Like, I just had to do something like that. I just had to write a woman like that. Like, I just could not have like a flat characters leading this story. And she Lou's lucky because she does have so many incredible women that like she takes after. Like, of course, Dorothy Hurston, of course, Ella Fitzgerald, and of course, Josephine Baker. And like she just had to be like them in the way that she is also complex and dynamic.
And there's also something very transgressive about their very existence, really, that idea that they would claim a sense of self at that moment in time is going against the grain completely. Thank you for that. I was so curious about who her grandmothers were, and so hearing that is wonderful. Cherie, I want to move us to Barbados now. Baxter's Beach, I think, it's a fictional resort that you've created where the book is set. Can you tell us a little bit about the places that inspired Baxter's Beach? And I also wondered what it would be like now.
So Baxter's Beach, yes, is a fictional beach in Barbados, and that's because there is no real beach quite like it. We do have some beaches on the west coast that have some of the features. So along our west coast, you will find, big luxury villas, and then very modest, big luxury villas that are probably inhabited by expats or tourists, wealthy tourists, and then very modest houses occupied by locals. And in some cases, the difference is quite striking. But there isn't a beach that has kind of the rough, craggy, physical appearance, as well as the great place for bathing and braiding tourist hair. So I kind of had to bring those characteristics together in a fictional beach. And that was really the reason why. But there's so many beaches. I remember as a girl going to Silver Sands Beach. Silver Sands is a very small fishing-based community in Christchurch, and I lived there for a while. So I know a lot of those memories kind of informed my descriptions in the book of Baxter's Beach and the surrounding areas. Then there would be Miami Beach, beaches on the West Coast, and beaches on the East Coast as well, which have that sort of craggy, rough, not good for bathing setup, but are breathtakingly beautiful, nevertheless. So those are some of the beaches that would have informed those descriptions and why.
There's a stark difference both in terms of sort of material things and in terms of how the characters perceive the place between those in the big houses and people like Adan, Lala, and Tone. It was interesting to me that Mira seemed to straddle those two experiences. Could we discuss her a little bit? Tell us and tell the audience about her and what it is you wanted to explore through her character, because I found her in equal parts problematic and fascinating.
So there is a community in Barbados that's known as the Red Leg community, and the community is essentially made up of descendants of Irish and Scottish indentured labor who would have come to Barbados, to work. However, there are some. Generally speaking, that community was neither accepted by the majority Afro-Bajan community nor the minority community, white Bajan community. And therefore they occupied a very interesting place. I think what interested me a lot about that was when that is, put within the context of the colorism that existed in Barbados at the time, it was just a very interesting dynamic, because although the descendants of that community will very much appear to be, you know, they have the physical characteristics that most Bajans at the time would have associated with being a person of means, based on how people sort of looked at people of a certain color in that time period. And although that is the case, the reality is very much different. And you will notice, for example, with Mira, she returns to the island as the wife of a very wealthy British man, and she enjoys the other side of paradise that the locals don't see. And when I say the other side, it's the other side for her because her origins are very modest. So she then gets the opportunity to live life from the other side. But yet still, when the policeman recognized that she is a descendant of that particular community, and she goes to get some assistance from them as it relates to her husband and the solving of his murder, she's automatically treated like any other poor baby, not given the same regard and respect that she would have been when they thought her origin was different because of the color of her skin. So to me, it was just very interesting to explore some of those differences, and some of those unique aspects, I think, of Bajan culture, especially at that time.
I think it's unique in the way that you describe it, but also familiar to me as someone who grew up in Southern Africa. That idea of, if you're white, this is what it means. And when that is sort of slightly upended, what happens there? She's a very, well, like all your characters, sort of so carefully drawn. And she does a lot of work in the novel, although she's not one of sort of the main characters. I'm glad you allowed us the time to focus in on her. I also really loved, I have to say, Cherie, I loved the fact that with Lala, you describe her as kind of like, you know, quite dark and heavy set, and maybe not as obviously appealing as one would think. At the same time, I think it's Wilma who says that, you know, the women in her family have this curse that once a man falls in love with them, that's it. And I loved this idea, you know, even though it doesn't always benefit Lala, of this kind of like impossible allure held within this body that you give her. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So for me, that was something that was really interesting. It's partially about the fact that one of the things I've observed over time, even with the, you know, experiences of women in my own family, is that we often tend to try to ascribe blame to the victim of a violent encounter, a victim of intimate partner violence. So there was that element of, you know, she's not that beautiful as far as her grandmother is concerned, but she is still attributed with being so compelling that, you know, her own grandmother empathizes with the man who treats her so horribly. So that was one part of it. But the other part of it for me was just questioning what really is beautiful. And for me, Lala is a beautiful woman. She's a beautiful woman. I admire her strength. I admire her resilience. I admire her quiet, contemplative nature. I just found there was something magical about her for me. And, you know, that's not only the case with her. There's a Queen of Sheba, for instance, who we don't get too much about her in terms of physical characteristics. I think because of the way she dresses, we might assume, you know, certain things about how she looks, but I think she's so feisty and she has so much personality. I think it was important for me to demonstrate the beauty of women and to show that it is not just, it's not just reduced to physical characteristics and never a particular set of physical standards. So that was important for me. So it was both things.
Yeah, I think that's really clear, but also the fact that it's not also that kind of beauty that we see within. you refuse for it to be simple, because while Lala is very strong, she does justify staying in a really bad situation. She does make some very bad decisions, but I think you're right. At the same time, that beauty just shines through, whatever it means, whether it means power or resilience or whatever else. You know, I think that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, she does make, yes, we might say she makes some bad decisions, but I think one of the things that I find very interesting as a writer and as an observer of people, I always think that who we are at any point in time is really a product of our circumstances, our upbringing, what we've seen, our experiences. So for me, it's difficult to see how Lala might make difference considering her background. And that was why it was so important for me to tell the story of Wilma and tell the story of Esme, and kind of let the reader in to some of the circumstances and some of the women who would have shaped Lala and who she is. Because I think it's easy sometimes to look at, you know, maybe to read a part of the book or look at Lala's character and think, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just leave? And I don't think we recognize the extent to which we're able to make that decision or come to that that thought quite quickly because of what we might have experienced before. And you know, it's therefore a question of, if Lala's experience is different, can we empathize? Can we understand why she is where she is?
And it's sort of a universal question that why don't you just leave? And it makes me think, Nekesa, of a part in your book where I think from the bit you just read, where Louise is just looking at her neighborhood and imagining what else is out there. And you get the sense of somebody, you know, within this sort of enclosed space where there's the rest of the world is just out there. And that for me came through as well with Lala. Cherie, I'm going to invite you to read to us right now so we can hear a little bit of the book. And could you, as Nekesa did, if you could set it up a little bit for us first.
Okay, so I'm going to read from a section towards the end of the book, chapter 25. It's my favorite chapter. And it's basically a bit of a rumination. Lala is thinking about her relationship with Aiden and reflecting. Aiden is her husband, and reflecting also on her relationship with Tone. So without giving too much away, Lala is married to Aiden, who is a criminal. And she lives with him and they have a baby, but she also does have a relationship with a character by the name of Tone. So yes, I'll just read from chapter 25. Lala, 5th January 1984. How do you learn to love a man? You first ask yourself this question when you are a new bride. These are the days when Aiden's robberies buy you clothing to replace on yellow dresses, orange suede ankle boots with kitten heels, and studded leather belts you can wear out for 24. These are also the days when Aiden first demonstrates his ability to box these clothes off of you, to tear these dresses, and beat you with the heels of the very booties he first presented in a bow-top box. On the night you first ask yourself this question, you braid your own hair in fat box braids piled high on top of your head to fall in heavy plaits down your back. You're wearing a little acid-wash denim jumpsuit that strains across a thickening belly and ends in a mini skirt you keep tugging back down your thighs. You're wearing a pink undershirt. On this night, you're still filled with joy each time you glance at your left hand and see Chinky's handiwork. You're still inebriated with the exaltation of being free to dress this way, in clothes Wilma would disapprove of, But on this night, you have ironed Aiden's tracksuit and fretted over how to navigate the cuffs and collar so that they will sit perfectly on wrists you're only just learning to fear. And then you watch as your husband gets dressed, splashes himself in cologne, puts on the bright white sneakers you have spent the better part of an afternoon rubbing with white hex. When the two of you arrive at the pasture on which Alpha 24 is hosting their New Year's dance, Aiden is swarmed by a bunch of his friends. Women in fishnet jumpsuits and mini skirts and gold hoops that eclipse the movement of their jaws as they chew chiclet gum. Men who call Aiden Big Man and Governor and touch their own blinging crusted fists to his and nod. And in this group of laughing, drinking, dancing buddies stands Tone, quietly sipping a soft drink against the gaily branded side of a stall that vibrates in time to pass the duchy. How do you learn to love a man? You might think you learn by doing. So after you've pressed your husband's clothes and whitened his sneakers and walked with him to the dance in your kitten-heeled orange booties, you might tramp those suede booties through the damp grass to fetch him his drinks, his food, and his Fanta. And then you might stand in front of him, allow it to seem like you are in his care, with your eyes perpetually on his cup to see when he might be in need of a refill. You might think that the flutter in your stomach when you watch him, the beauty of his black skin and white smile, and a broad, high brow beneath a brown hat, is the love you're learning by doing all these things. It is the love you're meant to have, and it will cushion the bruises the better you become at it. How do you learn to love a man? You might think you learn by obeying. So after your husband has had one too many gulps from a flask of whiskey, you do not say anything when the louder the jokes get bawdier and he seems less immune to the fawning of vultures dressed to look like peacocks. He tells you to go home. You need your rest, rubs your belly and says he will send one of his soldiers with you to keep you safe on your walk there. You do not say anything when the soldier he summons is none other than Tone, the strong young man you first met by a gutter, a man who now wears the brooding countenance of a gathering storm. You do not tell your husband that he should not send you with this particular man if he knows what is good for him. If he knows what is good for him, he should require you to stay right here by his side.
Thank you, Cherie. One of the things that I love most about your book was the sensation of riding along the waves of your really gorgeous prose. I think that reading was a really good example. And I wanted to speak a little bit about your use of language and the way that each character's voice, the words they use, their accent, as it were, tells us so much about who they are. You explained in a way that was fascinating to me about where Mira herself comes from. But I had no doubt about where I was in the world throughout the book. Although so much of it is universal, it's so firmly in place. And you do that not just by the setting, but through each bit of dialogue and the narrator's own use of language as well. Can you talk to us a little bit? And I should just say to the audience that I'd like to open up to you after this. So please do put your questions in the Q&A. So we can move on to those. But Cherie, I wonder before we open up, if you could just address the idea of language and how it's used. Oh, I hope we haven't lost Cherie. Oh, you're there, okay.
Yes, you can hear me.
Okay, say that again, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for me, this is, I was saying that for me, this is unapologetically a Bajan book. It's about, you know, average Bajan characters for me to show that authentically, it had to be reflected in the way that the characters speak to each other. So the authenticity of the dialogue was really important to me. And that was, I wouldn't say it was difficult to do, certainly not for me as a Bajan, as somebody from Barbados, but there was a little bit of a consideration of how it would be for other people who might not be from here or might not be familiar with the way we speak in terms of how that would be received. But I do think that, you know, it was important for me to make sure that the characters spoke authentically. So that was one thing. The other thing was, in telling this story, for me, you know, we have a very strong tradition of storytelling in the Caribbean and in Barbados. And it was just important for me to tell that story the way that we would tell it. So for instance, you know, if I'm telling you a story about you know, something that happened to my next door neighbor, and I'm telling you, you don't know my next door neighbor. So I will say, you know, I went down the road, you won't believe what happened last night. I was there talking to the neighbor and such happened. And you might say, the neighbor, like, who's the neighbor? I then have to tell you the story of the neighbor. So in telling you what happened down the road, I then go and tell you, you don't remember her? She's the woman, and da-da-da. And I tell you what happened to her. So that is very much present in how I structured the novel, because it was important to me that the story be told in that particular way. So yes, I'm really glad that people have embraced this story with that element, because I remember when I was studying, I was doing an MA in writing, and I did this story. I felt this very huge responsibility to tell a story that was very much grounded in where I was from, because I was the only, you know, person of color from the Caribbean in my class at the time. And I remember after delivering this story, one of the persons in the class said to me, but you know, you need a glossary. Like, you have to have a glossary at the end of this story. I didn't understand anything. I didn't understand, you know, what this meant and what that meant. And I had a really, really excellent tutor at the time who sort of set all of us straight as it related to that. And I never, you know, I feel strongly that I don't write as other. I am very firmly placed where I am from. And this is it for me. So I'm sharing that. To me, as an opportunity for people who might not be from where I'm from, or might not have experienced how we speak, you know, aspects of our language and our culture, to come into that world and explore common themes from my perspective. So that's what I'll say about that.
That's beautifully said. I don't know if you saw, but Nekesa and I both took a breath when you said glossary. We're horrified. I want to bring you in here because you spoke so well about this idea of sort of embodying the era physically, and it resonates with me when Cherie is talking about that kind of immersion that use of language gives you. And I wanted to twist it a little bit, because I read that you also, Nekesa, write romance novels. And for me, I'm really passionate about finding as many writers of color or as many queer protagonists inside genre fiction. And I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about your romance writing, and where can I find the book?
Okay, there are actually no romance novels. The novel I wrote before Dead Dead Girls was like a romance novel. So the reason why I chose a mystery in a historical setting is because I just finished writing a contemporary romance, and I wanted to like wanted to challenge myself. I think I like writing mysteries better. So there are currently no romance novels you can get or buy, but I'll let you know if that changes. I'm so sorry.
One of the wonderful things about this series, Cherie and Nekesa, is that you know, I had the opportunity to sort of research and choose the writers I wanted to feature. because you were all writers, I want to carry on reading. And so don't worry, there's time to write the mysteries and we'll wait for the romance novels, it'll be fine. I'd love to open out to the audience now, and I do have a couple of questions. So the first question comes from John, and it's for you, Nekesa, and it says, your reading evoked the novels of Jean Rhys for me, particularly in simply detailing casual conversation between two women in a city environment. And John wonders if Jean Rhys too was an influence for you.
Jean Rhys was not an influence. I do find that any type of similarities are purely accidental, but thank you, and I will, thanks, that's good, thanks.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. The next question, I think I'll address it to Cherie. It's from Ellah P, who says, how far would you say that your writing allows you to express vulnerability in a way you are unable to in the real world? Do your characters embody any of your own weaknesses or strengths, or are they wholly original? It's an interesting question because it's almost writing as therapy or as autobiography. And I just wonder how you feel about that, Cherie, and how you would respond.
Wow, that is a really good question. What I would say in terms of in writing this novel, I don't think it was about me being able to express vulnerability. I think it was very much about, point in time and how they respond to it. What I will say, that the personal connection that I had to it is that having also a survivor of domestic violence, I think it was quite difficult to write about some of the things that happened to Lala. And, maybe that was the vulnerability for me. It was kind of going into her world at that depth and trying to put that onto the page for a reader. It was quite difficult for me personally. But no, I don't actually think that writing about it allowed me to express my own. Generally speaking, I'm pretty in touch with my vulnerabilities and my weakness, and I think I express those pretty clearly. So yeah, that's a good question. It really made me think with that one.
Cherie, one of the things that I've found so interesting in talking to you about the book is that you have what for me as a publisher feels like a very healthy distance, that there's your life and then there's your art. And while there might be some crossover in terms of thematic resonance, they seem to me to be quite separate. So you may, correct me if I'm wrong, but I felt as if you had drawn from the environment, from the 80s, the memories of the 80s and so on. But this is really, this is a novel, it's a construction, it's an investigation. Oh, you're frozen again.
That is very much correct.
Yeah, there you are.
I'm sorry, can you hear me? Oh, yeah, so there are some, like you said, things that cross over, but generally speaking, yes, I do keep the two things quite separate. I almost feel as if I am in a different part of my brain when I'm writing than I am, when I'm just living normal life. So it's almost like it's a magical area. It's just a different aspect of myself.
Nekesa, you were very interesting in the way that you talk about sort of the research and the, what you took from the era and how you brought yourself into it. You're also very clear in saying that you wanted to write a book with someone like you in it. And those two things for me were sort of very interesting in response to this question, because that seemed to me just very clear that, Louise is not you. She's somebody who you needed to read about, therefore you had to write her in the way that, Toni Morrison tells us to write the book that you need. And so I just wonder if you could just address that a little bit. I'll tell you why I'm pushing it. I'm very concerned that as writers of color, it doesn't all become about biography, because what's very clear in reading both of your books is that the level of craft inherent in this, and that, you know, there's an intellectual pursuit here. It's not just about, you know, putting your lives on the page, as it were. But at the same time, Nekesa, you have claimed that, you know, what you wanted was to write from someone you recognize. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my mom is one of my first readers, and she was reading it and she's like, that's you. Louis is you, that's you. And there are some other plot points that like my friends have read and they're like, you did the exact same thing, you know that, right? So I think, so first I just want to say that Lou is cooler than I am. She's way cooler than I can ever be or hope to be. So there's that. I am uncool. She's just the pinnacle of everything cool, or everything I think is super cool. So there's that. I'm uncool. She's fantastic. But there's also like, I think just inherently with writing, and Cherie, you may agree with this, that like when you write characters, parts of you are in them anyway. Like parts of like what you write, like you just kind of end up in them. So like I think there's a character who I like to refer to as a lazy gay. I'm also kind of lazy. Like Rosa Maria is she is working at a newspaper and she like wants to like be a journalist, and she wants to be a writer. So like that's a bit of me. And Lou's very she's very like determined and very spunky, and she's very like scrappy. So I also think that there's bits of me in there as well. So I cannot say that any of these characters were like wholly based on me, but they do have parts of me, which I think is also very cool.
Thank you. I am going to wrap up now with one. I'm going to put two questions together. They're both from Anonymous. There could be two different Anonymouses, but anyway, we'll put the questions together. The first is how important do you find the first sentence of a novel? And the second is, what have been your experiences of publishing? So I wonder if you could sort of answer the last question first. I'm going to start with you. Could you tell us just very briefly about your road to publishing this novel? Because of course you had experience with the short stories that were very successful, and then this. What was that road to publishing like for you?
The road to this novel has been, you know, over 20 years in the making. And I often tell people, you know, your writing journey is your own. That certainly was the case for me. Prior to this, I considered myself primarily a short story writer. And when I realized that this project was going to become a novel, you know, I went down that road with a little bit of hesitation. Having finished the novel in 2018, I ended up offered feedback from the judges. I got that feedback, I refined it. My experience of publishing has really been amazingly good in one sense, in terms of the people who have worked with me, the responses that I've had. But I have to say, it's been a really long time in coming. So that is what I would say. It was really quick. It was a quick turnaround from, you know, getting my agent. I have a fantastic agent. From being signed by that agency to having something accepted was a really, really short period of time, and that was exhilarating. So it's been, you know, it's been surreal. It's been a wonderful ride, but it really has been a very long time in coming. I was just saying to somebody the other day, you know, in 1998, I was circling publishers in my copy of the Writer magazine from July 1998, and I had circled HarperCollins, you know, and that was an objective of mine. I thought it was going to be a short story collection at that point in time. But I had to say to somebody, you know, it took me like 20 years to get there, to get to the point of having HarperCollins as one of my publishers. So it's been a wonderful experience. Yeah, even if it's taken quite some time.
I think it's very encouraging for the audience to hear the 20 years and it can still happen. I think that's rather wonderful. Nekesa, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm very new to this whole publishing thing. Dead Dead Girls is my debut novel, and from like deciding to find an agent to getting a book deal was like 7 or 8 months, so it was really, really fast. but I have a great agent. I have a great editor. I'm at Berkeley with Penguin Random House, which is basically the dream. Like, I couldn't have asked for anything better than like what I have right now. And I have a great group of other debuts around me, and we talk every day. And yeah, so like publishing has just been fantastic to me so far, but like I also don't know if I have anything to complain about, because this is something I've been dreaming about since I was just a little kid, and now it's happening to me. And every day I get to wake up and go, oh my God, I have a book coming out and it's going to be fantastic. It's going to be amazing. So no complaints on the publishing for me. Publishing.
You have no idea. It makes me so happy to hear these two experiences, because I think, you know, if we were talking about Zora Neale Hurston, and I remember reading that she had been working as a maid cleaning in hotels before she died. And you think about all of those books and written within her, you know, it makes me so happy. It has been such a joy speaking to both of you. As I said, I spent the weekend with you. I enjoyed reading these books so much. I cannot encourage everyone enough to buy one, How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps the House. We didn't get to talk about the reason for the title, but that's a good thing, because now you have to buy the book to find out. It's really brilliant. And also, Nekesa, thank you for taking me to a place where I've actually been before in literature, but not through these eyes, and they're eyes I very much want to see through again. So to both of you, my thanks, and also I can't wait for what you'll do next. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.